website at rysec.org if you look under Sunday platforms. I'm often surprised by how many Americans don't realize that the residents of the District of Columbia do not have voting representation in either House of Congress. It may not surprise you to find out that those underrepresented residents are 50% Black or African American, 38% white, and 12% from other groups or of mixed heritage. Beginning with the 1964 election, after the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, residents of DC had the right, and still do have the right, to vote in the presidential election, and they have 3 electoral votes set to be equal to that of the least populous state, which has a lower population than DC does. But they still have no voting representation in Congress, nor anything that looks like a state legislature. Well, this year, 2020, is the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That amendment prevented states from limiting the right to vote on grounds of, quote, race, color, or previous condition of servitude, unquote. It passed 2 years after the passage of the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed that all male persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens, and that was meant to include African Americans who had been enslaved, and also free African Americans who had been denied rights of citizenship in many states. I'm going to talk next month a little bit about women getting the right to vote, because it's also the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, as well as the 150th anniversary of Black suffrage. But the story of that elusive right to vote, especially for Black and African American citizens, does not begin or end in 1870. At the very beginning, when the United States was formed as an independent nation, supposedly a democratic republic, voting was, the right to regulate voting was given to the states. And most states limited that right to white men who owned property or paid taxes. This is long before income taxes, which are paid by most people. It was when taxes were property taxes, so they both were ways to limit to people of property. It meant that the voters in that early time of America were about 6% of the total population. In New Jersey, even though women with property were given the right to vote along with men in 1789, that right of women to vote in New Jersey was rescinded in the early years of the 19th century. A few northern states gave free Black men the right to vote in 1789, but gradually from 1792 to 1838, some of those states, including Pennsylvania and New Jersey, took away the free Black male vote, even if these men otherwise qualified. And of course, enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of the population for the sake of figuring out how much representation a state would get, but they had no right to vote for those representatives. Meanwhile, Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democracy, so-called, widened the franchise incredibly among white men. Between 1792 and 1856, states removed property qualifications for voting for white men, sometimes limiting that to those born in the United States, but still not allowing non-property immigrants, even if naturalized citizens, to vote. In the 1820s presidential election, 108,000 ballots were cast. So 1820, 108,000. In the 1840 election, with these changes, 2,412,000 ballots were cast.
Whoa.
About 24 times the number of votes, just in 20 years. You know, I said property qualifications were removed, the last by 1856, but even by 1860, there were still 6 states that required voters to be taxpayers. 4 of them were northern and 1 of them was southern. Pennsylvania and Rhode Island retained that taxpayer requirement into the 20th century. So the 1870 passage of the 15th Amendment, which prevented states from using race, color, or previous certitude as grounds for denying the right to vote, significantly expanded who legally could vote. I want to give a side note. The 13th Amendment, established in 1865, abolished slavery and also abolished the 3/5 rule. The original Constitution had also, by the way, excluded from voting rights any, quote, Indians not taxed. The 13th Amendment also allowed for involuntary certitude as a punishment for crime. And that has been the basis for allowing imprisonment for crimes and taking away the right to vote. But today, many voting laws around the country exclude people who've been convicted of crimes from being able to vote even after they've served their time. Yet the 15th Amendment says states cannot exclude from the vote on grounds of previous condition of servitude. So I wonder why that wording hasn't been used to overturn those state laws which exclude those who've served their time. And indeed, excluding from voting rights those who are currently in prison and those who've served their terms is one of the continuing blocks on the right to vote that excludes millions of voters. In this country, those identified as black compared to those identified as white are measurably more likely to be incarcerated. For the same crimes, they're more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to be charged, they're more likely to be convicted, more likely to be given longer sentences, and more likely to be kept in prison longer for the same crimes. So one way that we continue to deny the right to vote disproportionately by race is in laws preventing ex-felons or even felons from voting. But let's go back to 1870 and that constitutional removal of race, color, and previous condition of servitude from legal restrictions on the right to vote. That also implied a right to serve in public office. And in 1870, the same year that passed, Hiram Revels became the first black man to serve as a United States Senator. He was elected in Mississippi. He had been born to free black parents in North Carolina. Some of the senators opposed his right to be seated as senator and tried to block his swearing in. They did not succeed. Blanche Kelso Bruce was also elected to the Senate from Mississippi, so there were 2 black senators, and he served a full 6-year term. Pinckney Pinchback was elected from Louisiana as a senator, and the Senate voted not to seat him. When Bruce left office, he was the last black senator until the 1960s. Between 1870 and 1887, in the House of Representatives, 17 black men were elected and served, all from the post-war South. Joseph Rainey of South Carolina is a name to remember as the first. Well, Reconstruction formally ended in 1877. And the view taught of Reconstruction for many years in our education system, and it may be influencing our own understanding of that period, was that Reconstruction was marked by the election of many incompetent black leaders. They weren't ready, it was the story. And they were pushed there by Northern carpetbaggers who were themselves corrupt. And so Southern whites had to intervene and restore order. That view does not hold up to historical documentation. Many of the black leaders were well-educated and accomplished people and quite competent. But an explicit attempt to restore white supremacy and suppress black representation in voting began in earnest in 1877 with the end of the federal presence in the South. No black Americans served in Congress between 1901 and 1929, for instance. The former Confederate states, now without limits from the federal government, began passing Jim Crow laws. and began establishing legal workarounds to the 15th Amendment. These laws disenfranchised black voters and also many poor white voters. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all were applied especially harshly against black would-be voters. A quote from a Mississippi official in 1890, when Mississippi established a poll tax: "The plan is to invest permanently the power of government in the hands of the people who ought to have them, the white people." It was an explicit white supremacy move. And when legal workarounds didn't prevent someone from voting, terrorism often was used. It might take the form of burning down your business. It might take the form even of lynching, which was used to stop many black men from voting. Most black men in the North were able to vote after 1870, but not many in the South. To add to the story of race and voting, in 1887 a law was passed granting citizenship and thus the right to vote to those Native Americans who were willing to dissociate themselves from their tribes. By 1924, when all Native Americans were then defined as American citizens and thus could vote, about 2/3 of Native Americans were able to vote, being not part of tribes. Maine was one of the last states to actually comply with the Indian Citizenship Act. It took until the 1960s for all states to comply, to a law passed in 1924. But Native Americans were still often prevented from voting by poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. It took until 1943 for Chinese immigrants to be granted the right to become citizens and the right to vote. After 1920, being a woman was no longer permitted itself as a restriction on the right to vote. But many women didn't get a right to vote with that amendment to the Constitution because as black women, Native women, Chinese women, they were still excluded on other grounds. And then with the civil rights movement and the moral and political pressure of that movement, in the 1960s, many of the legal restrictions on the right to vote began to fall. DC voters could vote in presidential elections starting in 1961, and that affected black voters disproportionately. The Supreme Court established finally the principle of one man, one vote. The 24th Amendment prohibited a poll tax payment as a voting requirement. Tax payment requirements and wealth requirements were prohibited by a Supreme Court decision as late as 1966. You know, I've talked with people who are among those who were working on the ground organizing in the 60s and 70s to make these new laws into reality. They tell of the terror they still felt. It was risking death to register to vote or to assist people in registering to vote. The organizers who convinced people to vote and the brave few who were the first to register were often in danger. In 1963, Fannie Lou Hamer and some others were returning from a voter registration workshop in South Carolina. They had, on the bus home, refused to sit in the whites-only section of the Greyhound, and the bus driver said that he was going to call the police at the next stop. And then when the bus stopped for a rest, Fannie Lou Hamer and her crew sat at the whites-only lunch counter when the bus had stopped there for the meal time. The police came and arrested all of them. At the jail, prison guards ordered 2 of the African-American prisoners already there to beat Fannie Lou Hamer, nearly killing her. She lost vision in one eye and suffered permanent kidney damage, probably contributing to her early death at age 59. An all-white jury acquitted the police charged with starting the beating. And yet Fannie Lou Hamer persisted in working for voter registration and other civil rights. This is a tale not just of suppression, but of resilience. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed. Other laws were passed to extend the right to vote even further. Some of you referred to the Voting Rights Act, the constitutional amendment that was passed in 71 and was first acted in 72 of lowering the age of voting to 18. There were also laws forbidding long residency requirements passed in 1972, which was another way to suppress people voting. If you haven't lived here for 10 years, you couldn't vote. There were also laws passed giving citizens and military members living overseas the right to vote. That was 1986. Between 1996 and 2008, many states had loosened restrictions on the voting rights of those who had served terms for felonies. The Voting Rights Act itself was a mainstay for decades of actually enforcing all these laws. States with a history of violating voter rights were held to a higher standard than others, requiring prior permission before instituting new rules. The Voting Rights Act was extended 4 times under both Democrats and Republicans, and the latest in 2006. Then in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act on the basis that they were no longer needed. We were done with voter suppression. But just as there was a backlash after the Civil War to the exercise of black voting rights, in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, we saw another backlash started. Fears that the demographic trend was that white citizens would be sometime in the 21st century a numerical minority ramped up efforts by some to diminish the effects of that trend. Public statements were often phrased as concern about voter fraud. Yet there were very few convictions for voter fraud, and most of those convictions were white citizens. Paul Weyrich, an American conservative activist, he was a co-founder of the Heritage Foundation and of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, that group which proposes conservative laws to state legislatures. He's been very clear about voting rights. A simple quote from him: "I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down." The right to vote has always been an elusive right for many, and with new laws and policies, the right to vote has been suppressed more than expanded. DC residents still do not have voting representation in Congress. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about my own experience with voting fraud, which goes back to my college days and later when I lived in Chicago, infamous Chicago. In those days, we had essentially 3 political parties in the city. The regular Democrats, the independent Democrats, we called them the regulars and the independents, and the Republicans. The Republicans were by far the smallest of those 3 groups. Chicago regular Democrats are infamously remembered for keeping on the rolls or registering many dead people, and for voting fraud. Less known is that voting fraud was actually rampant throughout Illinois. It's just that we don't hear about it as much outside of Chicago. It was kind of equal opportunity fraud by all parties. In my younger years when I lived in Chicago, I often worked on election day as a poll watcher to try to spot or prevent voter fraud. And yes, there was voter fraud. My first election day, I worked in an Irish neighborhood. I think they thought an 18-year-old who couldn't even vote yet needed to have an easy place to start out being a poll watcher. The regular Democratic precinct captain came in, bringing food for the judges and the voters, and with every voter who came in, he greeted them, saying things like, "How does your cousin like the job I got him?" Or just generally chatting them up. He knew everybody, it was clear. A police officer was assigned in Chicago regularly, I know it still is true, to each polling place. And the police officer asked me why I thought I needed to be there. There's nothing bad happening here. No, just a lot of very subtle pressure. There were a few other Chicago elections where the discomfort was a lot greater, where it was clear that the presence of poll watchers made a difference. In one election, my fellow poll watcher and I got there early because part of our job was to watch them open the voting machines. We got there and they had already opened one of them before the time that they were allowed to do so. And then we watched them open the second one and noted that it already had 300 plus votes recorded.
Early voter.
Yeah. We called the voting office on that one, and we had the machine taken out of service. But I do know about fraud firsthand, and that it does happen. Those judges that day were really upset at us and gave us the silent treatment all day. I imagine, actually, that they were in trouble. And in a machine-run city, they may have had jobs arranged through patronage that were in jeopardy for their failure to have implemented the plan. And then Harold Washington ran for mayor, a black man. Emotions ran high. The racism in the commentary was incredible, and this was even before the internet. And so was voter suppression and fraud. It was in Harold's first winning election that I was a poll watcher in a polling place in a senior housing building. We'd been notified that there were some people in the building who wanted our help because they felt they were being intimidated by a person who was on staff at the housing unit who had keys to everyone's apartments. And so if we had the pictures of these people to watch as they came through the door, so if we got to them first, we could help them vote. But if we weren't quick enough, this staff person would jump in, and these people didn't feel comfortable turning her down. Twice I heard loud voices in the little booth saying, "That's not who I wanted to vote for." Yet these people were too intimidated to file charges. Now, I did catch sight out of the corner of my eye of something else going on that was strange. I noticed a guy in the hall just kind of sitting there, and he had a big coat on. It was like February or March. And people who came in, some of them would come over to him, lean in really close and kind of furtively, and then go vote, and then come back, and then go lean in close again and talk to him. And so I watched. And soon I saw a ballot change hands and some money. And sure enough, I had managed to catch a chain voting scheme. Now, if you think paper ballots are completely free of fraud possibilities, remember chain voting. One voter goes in first, and instead of turning in their ballot, they bring it blank out to the coordinator, the person who's running the scheme, the guy in the big coat. Then the ballot is marked by the coordinator, or punched if it's a punch ballot. And when the next voter comes in, they get that already marked ballot so the guy knows he's getting what he paid for. And they have to come out with a clean ballot in order to get that money. It's a vote for hire scheme. And I'd heard about it before, but I had never seen it. Yes, I had our assigned police officer watch, and it was too obvious. He had to confirm what I'd seen and arrest the coordinator. But it was after 5-10 ballots had already been cast in that way. I wonder how many votes for Harold Washington were suppressed and how many votes for his opponent were bought. Today, as the quote from Weyrich makes clear, suppressing the vote is an explicit strategy to suppress votes, especially those of people of color. I don't want everybody to vote. Remember that quote? Our leverage in the elections goes up as the voting populace goes down. Strategies today for suppressing the votes include closing polling places. You may have heard him say that the man in the 89-year-old in the clip now has to walk 3.5 hours to the closest polling place. It makes poor people walk for hours to get to their polling place. It makes it hard, even in cities, for people who are working to get to vote. Closing of registration locations is another strategy. In most cases, voters have closed polling places and registration locations disproportionately in majority non-white counties and neighborhoods. Disproportionate conviction and incarceration of non-whites paired with laws restricting voting of ex-felons is another way to racially bias the vote. Or establishing a poll tax, despite it being illegal to do so, by requiring payments be made before an ex-felon can vote, as has happened in Florida and is currently being litigated. For Native Americans on reservations, the lack of formal addresses has been used to deny their right to vote in many states. Actually, losing thousands of ballots is another strategy. We saw that in Georgia in the gubernatorial election recently. And then there's challenging voters who actually do have valid IDs, hoping that they're going to give up. Removing eligible voters from the rolls. In Florida in 2000, they used algorithms to decide who were duplicates. And they used algorithms that selectively preferred names, which I'm very well aware of, like Lewis and Johnson. I would probably have been removed in Florida. But they're names which are more typical for Black citizens. In some states recently, removing your registration just because you haven't voted recently. Or lack of any paper ballots, which even though paper ballots can be part of fraud, it's harder. But without paper ballots, a recount cannot check your original vote to see whether it matches what you intended. And then there are voter ID laws, which always make voting more difficult. And it requires IDs that are more difficult for older people and poor people to get. And then sometimes, even when there are voter IDs, selectively checking them. I can tell you my own story about that. I lived for years in Virginia and voted there. I always liked to go vote at 2 in the afternoon, when I could go in and out very quickly, and even for presidential elections. And I didn't have to be one of those people clogging up the lines for those people who had to go before or after work. But in 2008, Virginia had instituted voter ID laws. And it took me 30 minutes to vote at 2 p.m. instead of just walking in and walking out. You know, voter ID laws not only exclude some people who can't afford the fees for buying their IDs, paying for their IDs, it also includes older citizens, especially in rural areas where a lot of the elderly don't have birth certificates in this country. They didn't keep them, especially for African Americans in rural districts. So in 2008 in Virginia, acceptable forms of public ID included driver's license, a state ID, public university IDs. There were several others. And because it was Virginia, they included your gun permit as one of the acceptable IDs. And there was selective enforcement. I noticed that in 2008, my license was only checked with a quick glance to see that I had it, while the black man next to me was asked for a second piece of ID to verify his driver's license, even though the law said the driver's license was enough. And by 2008, Virginia had also selectively closed voter registration and early voting locations. About 3/4 of the ones they closed were in neighborhoods and counties that were majority black. But that wasn't good enough for the members of the state legislature who wanted to suppress voting. So in 2012, they tightened it up further. Student IDs and some other IDs were out. Gun permits were still fine. And requirements for the poll watchers to actually check the IDs were greater, so that there wasn't selective checking. Everybody got checked thoroughly. More early voting and voter registration locations had been closed. Also, more polling places had been closed. I went in at 2 p.m. again. I used to go in and out. In 2008, it was 30 minutes. In 2012, it was 3.5 hours. Voter ID laws work to suppress voting. Some people couldn't stay for 3.5 hours, being in hourly paid jobs or having to be back to relieve a babysitter. And it didn't just happen and doesn't just happen in the South. At least 5 people I know who live in Brooklyn and who voted in every election and hadn't moved in years showed up to vote in the 2016 primary and found that they were no longer on the voting rolls in Brooklyn. Check yourself before any deadline. Make sure that some accident didn't happen and remove you from the rolls. In our representative democracy, voting rights, I believe, are about more than just voting. They're about who matters, whose voice is heard, and even who's really considered fully human. In 2008, Bill and I took part in a nonpartisan voting registration effort in Virginia, and we were assigned to a shopping center in an ethnically diverse suburban neighborhood. We were there on Saturday for all the grocery shoppers. We noticed as we were asking people about whether they wanted to register to vote, there were a couple different kind of reactions. One was, oh, I'm registered. Another one was, oh, sure, I'll register. I've moved and I need to re-register. But some people had a kind of an unexpected reaction to us. They didn't even answer directly and often just kind of scooted off. After the first few, I decided to take a chance with one, and we were away from others, so I just asked him quietly, was he able to register to vote? No, he said, I served time in prison for a year, 20 years ago. I've remade my life since then, but I can't register to vote. I asked him, was your crime one of violence, may I ask? No, he said, just possession of weed. Oh, I said, under Virginia law, you can petition to get your voting rights back. His look completely changed, and my thought of what voting means to a lot of people changed in that moment. As I thought about it afterwards, and Bill and I both reflected on it, it was like a burden had been lifted from him, and he could see himself differently. I think of Lindsay's experience with that pride you said the first time, and having that denied, and then suddenly it's within hope again. Talking to a few more of the people who it seemed obviously couldn't register, we discovered something very interesting through our curious questions. Even though Virginia had long allowed restoration of voting rights after time served, if the felony were certain nonviolent crimes, nobody had ever told these ex-prisoners that they had the right to petition to get their voting rights back. It wasn't part of their, what they were told when they were leaving prison. I'm glad to say Virginia has later made it much easier to restore your voting rights, but that encounter that day really changed some of my perspective on voting rights. It's not just about whether you can vote, it's about whether you're a full citizen or maybe even fully a person. Voting rights are human rights. Now, as you may know from your own reading, voting rights are still very elusive and often selectively by ethnicity and color, with Black and brown people more likely to have problems voting. In some states, the number of registered voters has gone down significantly from 2004, 2008 to 2012, and even further since 2016. We can expect that there will be a lot of organizing to register voters and to protect their voting rights when they get to the polling place. We also have to recognize that the census that's coming up may be biased enough not to count as many people of color, adding another dimension to diminishing one's voice and vote. One of the best actions you can take in 2020 on Election Day, if you are able to, is to go to a state where such fraud and suppression is more common and be a poll watcher. Eyes on the process do make a difference. And now a disclaimer. I don't want you to think that I think that elections are the most important thing in politics. In fact, my belief is that elections are about 10% of the work to get good policies passed or bad policies prevented. But it's that 10% around voting that makes it possible or impossible, or easier or harder, for that other 90% that we also have to do. If you're not represented in political offices, and if you don't have a voice, it's a lot harder to implement policy or to reverse bad policy. So as America celebrates the 150th anniversary of removing race and color from restrictions on voting, let's remember that there are still many ways that race and color and ethnicity are the major factor in who can and can't vote, in who can vote more easily or vote with more difficulty. The right to vote is only as strong as our ability to exercise it. Protecting the right to vote is a basic essential to preserving any semblance of a democratic republic, ruled by the people and their representatives, rather than by autocrats selected by a few. So we're now going to say goodbye to our live stream audience. Thanks for being with us. You can find out more about us at rysec.org.